When Mark got fired, it didn't even happen in a private room. Greg called him into the conference area, smiled and said, "We're letting you go. Misconduct." Everyone looked away. No one said a word. By noon, his email was gone. By 3 p.m., his keycard didn't work. By 5 p.m., his fiancée Laura sent a text, "I need time to think." That was 3 years ago. He still remembered Greg's voice when he said it, calm, patronizing, like he was explaining something to a child. Greg always sounded like that, even when he was lying through his teeth. At the time, Mark didn't even fight back. He froze. The accusation had come out of nowhere. Company funds missing, numbers falsified. Greg framed it as an internal mistake. But the story spread fast. The quiet accountant turned out to be the thief. Everyone bought it because Greg smiled while he told it. After that, no one wanted to hire him. The industry was small. His name was toxic. Mark moved back to Dayton, rented a single-bedroom apartment with creaking floors, and started freelancing, small tax prep jobs, online gigs, anything to survive. He stopped wearing suits. He stopped answering calls. His mother asked if he was okay. He lied and said yes. He told himself he didn't care anymore, that it was over. But every time he checked the news and saw Greg's company expanding, his chest burned. Greg had been promoted. He was on panels, podcasts, magazine covers. A man of vision, they called him. Mark knew exactly what kind of man he was. He didn't start with a plan. He started with curiosity. He still had access to a few old spreadsheets, backup copies on a personal drive, nothing illegal. He looked at them one night just out of spite. Then he noticed something small, a pattern. The same vendor names showing up under different departments. Greg's style. So Mark started collecting. Slowly, patiently. He scraped public records, read filings, used LinkedIn to track Greg's new projects. He built folders, labeled everything by date, amount, and connection. It was almost funny how easy it was. Greg hadn't even changed his methods. Same shell companies, same fake invoices. Mark never thought of himself as a vengeful person. But he started waking up earlier. He ate better, worked harder. For the first time in years, he had direction. The idea came to him when he read about private investment groups. Small partnerships that buy stakes in startups. It was the perfect bait. Greg loved easy money. Mark spent months building a believable online identity. A fake fund, a fake team, a fake website, all polished and professional. He even paid someone to record voice lines for conference calls. Every detail had to look right. He wasn't rushing it. He'd learned patience from his fall. The first time Greg's assistant responded, Mark's hands shook a little. He hadn't expected it to work so fast. But Greg remembered his name, and that helped. A man like Greg loved poetic symmetry. The guy he once destroyed now offering him a deal. They met at a high-end restaurant in Cincinnati. Greg was wearing an expensive watch, a fake tan, and the same smug grin. "Mark Turner," Greg said, leaning back. "Didn't think I'd see you again. Guess no hard feelings?" Mark smiled. "None at all." They shook hands. Mark ordered bourbon. He didn't even drink. As Greg talked about his new ventures, Mark just listened. He'd learned that silence made people reveal themselves faster. Greg went on about offshore investors, new startups, the freedom of private capital. Mark nodded and asked the right questions, careful not to sound too eager. When Greg left that night, he was already thinking about how to use Mark. Mark knew it. That was the point. He went home, poured the bourbon down the sink, and opened a new folder on his laptop. He called it Operation Bridge. It was the same name Greg had used years ago for the fake project that ruined him. This time, it would burn from the other side. Over the next few months, Mark built the world Greg wanted to believe in. He created fake profiles, investors with clean LinkedIn histories, family photos borrowed from stock sites, backgrounds that checked out under surface-level searches. He used burner phones, encrypted email chains, fake Zoom backdrops. Every piece of it felt disturbingly easy. People believed what they wanted to believe. Greg wanted to believe he was still smarter than everyone else. The deal was simple. A private fund buying into a new fintech company Greg had started. On paper, it looked solid. The numbers made sense, the projections were believable. Mark even made the documents intentionally flawed, small, obvious things that Greg would notice and fix, to make him feel in control. It worked. Greg started calling weekly. He dropped his corporate polish and spoke like they were old friends. "You're a good guy, Mark. Glad to see you landed on your feet," he said once. Mark forced a small laugh and said, "Yeah, thanks to people like you." Inside, he could feel the old heat again. But it didn't burn like rage. It was colder now, focused. He knew Greg was still laundering money, moving funds between subsidiaries, pushing payments through fake vendors. The man was addicted to the game, so Mark let him play. He let Greg believe the fund was interested in a $5 million partnership. Enough to make him desperate. Enough to make him careless. Meanwhile, Mark had quietly reached out to someone he'd sworn he'd never talk to again. His old co-worker, Dana. She'd been there the day he was fired. She hadn't defended him, but she hadn't spoken against him either. A safe survivor. When she picked up the phone, there was a long pause before she said, "Mark." "Yeah," he said. "I just need information. You still with Allied Capital?" She hesitated. "You know I can't. I'm not asking for much. Just tell me if Greg's still running internal projects through that shell in Delaware." Silence. Then a sigh. "You didn't hear it from me." That was all he needed. With her tip, Mark pieced everything together. The fake vendor names, the same routing numbers, the recycled tax IDs. Greg hadn't even hidden it well. He just assumed no one would look. Mark started copying everything, screenshots, filings, transaction trails. He didn't plan to give it to the police himself. That would only draw him in. He needed a third party. So he called an old contact from his brief freelance accounting work. A guy named Jeff who'd once bragged about consulting for federal cases. Mark invited him to dinner, played dumb, asked if he ever worked with financial crimes. Jeff laughed. "Sure. You'd be surprised how easy it is to catch idiots with paper trails." Mark smiled. "Yeah, I'd be surprised." The trap was ready. Over the next 2 weeks, he let Greg believe the deal was finalizing. Contracts were drafted. Calls were scheduled. Mark even arranged a signing party at a downtown venue Greg loved. The same one where Greg had hosted his company's 10th anniversary. Greg called him the night before. "You know, Mark, I always respected you. You were just too by the book. Too scared to play big." Mark said quietly, "Maybe I just didn't like the rules you played by." Greg laughed. "Then make your own." That's what I did. Mark hung up, closed his laptop, and sat in silence. His apartment was almost empty. Just a couch, a coffee maker, and stacks of files. No photos. No noise. He thought about Laura. About the life he'd had before all of this. He wondered what she'd think of him now, if she'd even recognize him. Probably not. By morning, he'd already sent the full documentation to Jeff. A quiet note attached. "Potential fraud in progress. Contact me only if necessary." Then he got dressed. Dark suit, clean shave, calm face. The kind of man Greg would underestimate again. At the party, everything looked perfect. White lights, champagne, background jazz. Greg was in his element, shaking hands, laughing too loud. He saw Mark across the room and raised his glass. "Didn't think you'd pull this off," Greg said, grinning. "Guess you learned something from me after all." Mark smiled back. "Guess I did." Greg had no idea that the private investors mingling around them weren't investors at all. They were undercover federal agents, briefed only hours before. The sting had begun. The night started like every other corporate event Greg had ever thrown. Too much ego, too much champagne, and not enough honesty in the room. Mark stayed near the back, close enough to see but far enough to be ignored. He didn't drink. He just watched. Greg moved through the crowd like a politician, touching shoulders, laughing too hard, throwing his money around like it meant something. The fake investors were already there, 3 agents in tailored suits, playing the part perfectly. They smiled, shook hands, signed fake paperwork. The real transfer would never happen. It was just the setup, the proof the bureau needed to move in. Mark's heart was steady. He'd rehearsed this night 100 times in his head. No slips, no emotion. Greg stood on a small stage, tapping his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, a toast," he said, his voice slick and confident. "To new partnerships, bold ventures, and the courage to take risks." People clapped. Someone shouted, "Here! Here!" Mark raised his empty glass. Greg smiled wide. And a special thanks to an old friend, Mark Turner, who helped make tonight possible. Life's funny. Huh? Sometimes the past just finds its way back. The crowd laughed politely. Greg looked right at him. No hard feelings, right? Mark held his gaze. None at all. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. Just once. A short vibration. The signal. He slipped it back slow. Watched Greg take another sip. Oblivious. The doors opened quietly, 2 agents at first, then 4 more. They moved in sync, no shouting yet, just control. The music cut mid-beat. The lights shifted slightly, too bright now. Someone asked what was going on. Then one of the agents stepped forward, badge out. Gregory Larson, you're under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and wire fraud. It was like someone flipped a switch. Greg laughed, confused. What the hell is this? You've got the wrong guy. But they already had the papers, the same ones Mark had handed over, with Greg's own forged signatures. Mark stood still. He didn't move, didn't speak. Greg's laughter cracked, turned sharp. Mark, he barked. You brought these people here? You did this? Mark didn't answer. He just looked at him. Greg's face twisted. You think this makes us even? You think they'll believe? An agent pulled his hands behind his back. The cuffs clicked loud in the silence. Mark turned away. He walked out before the press arrived, before the crowd started whispering, before Greg started yelling his name. Outside, the city was quiet. Cold air hit his face. He walked 2 blocks before realizing his hands were shaking. He wasn't sure if it was adrenaline or something else. He found a small bar a few streets down. Empty, dimly lit, the kind of place where no one asks questions. He ordered a whiskey, stared at it for a long time, then pushed it aside. His phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. Good work. He'll be processed tonight. He turned the phone off. For a moment, he thought he'd feel something, satisfaction, justice, maybe even peace. But there was just quiet. He looked at the glass, the amber light bending through it, and thought of all the things Greg took from him. His job, his name, Laura, the years that could have been something. And yet, even now, after all this, he didn't feel like he'd won. He just felt empty. He drove home that night in silence. The highway was dark and wet, headlights cutting through the rain. Somewhere along the way, he realized he wasn't driving toward his apartment. His hands had turned the wheel without thinking. He ended up outside the old office building, the same one where Greg had fired him 3 years ago. The lights were still on inside. A janitor moved slowly down the hall with a mop. Mark sat there for a while, engine running, windshield wipers scraping rhythmically. He thought about walking in just to see the place again, to stand where he'd fallen apart. But he didn't. Instead, he turned the car off, leaned back, and let the sound of the rain fill the silence. For the first time, there was no plan left. Nothing to fix, nothing to build, no one to fool. Greg was finished. The story was over. So why did it still feel like something was missing? Greg's arrest made the morning news. Mark saw it without meaning to. A clip autoplayed on his laptop while he was checking emails. Greg in handcuffs, escorted out of a courthouse, still wearing the same navy suit from the night before. His hair was messy, his face pale, eyes darting like an animal's. The caption read, "Local CEO charged in multimillion-dollar fraud scheme." Mark closed the browser before the video ended. He went through the day like nothing happened. Worked a little, made coffee, cleaned his apartment. But everything felt too quiet, the kind of silence that hummed in the back of your head. Late that afternoon, someone knocked on his door. It was Jeff, the contact who'd helped Loop in the FBI. He leaned against the frame, smiling. "You did good, man. They've got him dead to rights." Mark nodded. "Yeah." Jeff waited a moment, expecting more. "You should celebrate. Hell, you took down a corporate predator. That's a win in my book." Mark forced a small smile. "Thanks." Jeff clapped him on the shoulder. "Seriously, most people wouldn't have had the patience. You're one cold son of a bitch, you know that?" When the door closed, Mark just stood there. Cold son of a bitch. He wasn't sure if it was a compliment. That night, he went for a walk. November air, sharp and dry. The city lights blurred in the puddles on the pavement. Every sound, car tires, voices, dogs barking, felt distant. He ended up near the river, the same place he'd gone to think after losing his job years ago. Back then, He'd stood there trying to figure out how his life had fallen apart. Now, he was here trying to figure out if it had been worth putting back together. He sat on a bench and watched the water move. The current didn't care about what it carried: dirt, light, reflection, debris. It just kept going. His phone buzzed again. A number he didn't know. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and he answered without thinking. A woman's voice. Mark. Took a second. Laura. He said nothing. I saw the news, she said quietly. About Greg. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I should have believed you. Mark stared at the water. Doesn't matter now. It does, she said. He ruined you and you fixed it. No, he said. I just evened it out. Silence. Then she said, You sound tired. I am. She didn't ask to see him. He didn't offer. After a while, the line went dead. He sat there a while longer, watching the ripples under the bridge lights. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, then faded. He thought about Greg, probably sitting in a cell, replaying everything in his head, realizing who had set the trap. Maybe he'd hate him. Maybe he'd admire him for it. Maybe both. But that wasn't the point anymore. Revenge hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't brought back his job or his name or the years he'd lost. It hadn't filled the hollow part of him that Greg left behind. It just ended the story. And maybe that was enough. He stayed until the cold finally bit through his coat, then stood, hands in pockets, and started walking home. No rush, no plan. Just steps on wet pavement, one after another. Behind him, the city lights glowed on the water, gold, fractured, and moving on.